Many years ago, I was facing an important and difficult decision. I needed God's guidance. And there was one passage of Scripture that had once helped me before in a similar situation, so I turned to it again. It was James chapter 1, where James writes, "If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting. For the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded and unstable in all his ways." What caught my curiosity this time was this word doubt. We normally associate that word doubt with uncertainty or unbelief. But how do those concepts fit in with this context? So I went to the original Greek text as James wrote it in hopes of getting clarity as to what he is telling us. And what I found surprised me. So let's take a look. Again, we go back to our trusty BibleHub.com/interlinear. Click on interlinear chapters. And go to James, and it opens up to James chapter 1. So let's scroll down to verse 6, where we find these words that are translated as doubt or doubting. The word here is diakrino, and it is repeated exactly the same way. Our grammar code here tells us it's a verb in the participle form. So let's look this up in the lexicon. And so the dictionary form we find is diakrino, and the definitions offered are to distinguish, to discern, to judge, and to doubt, as it's translated here in James chapter 1. Meanings offered include separate, distinguish, discern one thing from another, to doubt, to hesitate, to waver. Here's important information, the word origin. The root of the word is krino, meaning to judge, or to separate, or distinguish, and dia is a preposition. Greek likes to make compound words by adding prepositions to verbs, and as a preposition it means through, or thoroughly. In a sense, it intensifies the meaning of the word krino. We'll see this come again later in our study. And in this context of James chapter 1, the meaning of diakrino or diakrino really heavily leans on the sense of this word as to critically analyze. And with this insight to the word here, that it's translated doubt, helped me to realize was that God had already shown me what he wanted me to do. And quite honestly, I didn't want to do it. So my continuing search for his guidance was actually a search for a second opinion. And I was asking God to tell me what he wanted me to do, while I reserved the right to make a value judgment on his direction and reserve the right to veto, if you will, to make my own decision. And that person, says James, must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord, for he's double-minded and unstable in all his ways. In other words, pray for God's direction with that kind of attitude. Forget it. He's not going to show you. Well, this surprise and discovery of this meaning of the word doubt in James chapter 1 got me curious about other words in the New Testament that are also routinely translated as doubt. And I found several, each one with its own distinct meaning. So let's take a look. When the subject of doubt arises in the Bible, what's the first story that comes to mind that exemplifies doubt? It's a story of poor doubting Thomas in John chapter 20. So let's go to John and chapter 20. You know the story. Thomas was absent when Jesus appeared to the rest of his disciples in the upper room that first evening. The next day they shared the exciting news with Thomas, and what was his response? But he said to them, "If I do not see in his hands the mark of the nails, and put my finger into the mark of the nails, and put my hand into his side," it says, "No, I will not believe." It says it in the most emphatic form possible. Let's look at the word believe first. And the verb is ἀπιστέω. Ἀπιστέω, and the noun form pistos, meaning faith or believe. The verb means to believe, have faith and trust. And Thomas says, "I will not believe." Then Jesus appears to him the following week. It says after 8 days. Remember, in the Hebrew method of counting, you count from the day you're on. So 8 days from that day, counting from Sunday to the 8th day. From that day would be the following Sunday. We call it 7 days later, or a week later. Thomas was with them. Jesus stood among them, and he said to Thomas, says, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Put your hand into my side. Do not be apistos," is the word, unbelieving. And this is the word that some English versions of the Bible translate as doubt, the NIV in its iterations and others as well. But most translations actually translate this word not doubt or doubting, but translate that as unbelieving. Well, we recognize this part of the word, the pistos part of the word, which means faith, but apistos is a prefix that makes it a negative, unbelief. Apistos is the dictionary form. It's an adjective, and it means unbelieving, faithless, unfaithful. And it is derived from the Greek prefix a, meaning not, and the adjective meaning faithful or believing. So unbelief is one of the words that we find appearing as doubt in some English translations, applicable here in the story of doubting Thomas. In the story of our Lord's resurrection, this is actually not the first occurrence of the word doubt that we find. For that, we go to the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24. This is where Jesus appears to the disciples in the upper room the first time, after he appeared to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. Starting here at verse 36, he himself stood among them, and he says to them, "Peace to you." But they were petrified, they were terrified, and filled with fear, thinking that they were seeing a spirit, pneuma. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts arise in your hearts?" Greek word here in the text is dialogizomai, and let's look at the lexicon study on that. The dictionary form is dialogizmos. It's a noun, and you might notice something that gives away what this word means. Does that look like the word dialogue? That's exactly what it is. It means reasoning, thought, not just having an idea, but serious contemplation, argument, debate, or in our context it's translated as doubt, calculation, reasoning, thought, intense thought, movement of thought, deliberation, plotting. From the Greek verb dialogizomai, to reason or debate. So let's go to dialogizomai and see if we get more insight to this word, this verb, which means to reason, to consider, debate, to ponder. The word origin comes from that prefix preposition, dia, which means through or by, or can be thoroughly. And logizomai means to reason or consider. So what we see in this text in Luke chapter 24, Jesus is saying to his disciples, why are you mentally debating what you're seeing? You can believe your eyes, it's really me. Here the word doubt does not mean unbelief, it just means trying to figure it out. The third occurrence of the word doubt in the resurrection story we find in the last chapter of Matthew. Matthew chapter 28, going down to verse 17. And this is the last part of the chapter of Matthew. We refer to the Great Commission, but this is how it begins. And the 11 went to Galilee, to the mountain, it says, where Jesus had assigned them, told them to go. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. However, some doubted. This word in the Greek is distazo. The dictionary form is distazo. It's a verb. It means to doubt or to waver or hesitate. It is also a compound word. The main root of the verb is stazo. Comes from the verb histemi, which means to stand. And the prefix dis means twice or double. So quite literally, this means trying to stand at two places at the same time. And so as we see that word in this context, this verb distazo, it does not mean unbelief. It does not mean critically analyze. But what it means is a hesitancy, a reluctance to commit. After all the disciples had seen and heard and knew to be true, some still hesitated to fully to commit to Christ. Seems incredible. I just wonder, since this only appears in the Gospel of Matthew, I wonder if this is Matthew's own story. Now there we have 4 different Greek words that we've encountered. All get translated into the New Testament in English as doubt, that have different, very different words in the Greek language. There's one more that we don't see in modern English translations, but appears quite often in the King James Version. I presume it's actually an obsolete meaning of the word doubt that we don't use anymore. For that, we're going to go to Acts chapter 25. Where Paul stands on trial before the Roman governor Festus. When it is apparent that the outcome of Festus's verdict is not going to be in Paul's favor, Paul makes his appeal to Caesar. Festus now has to write a letter to Caesar, Nero, and explain why Paul is coming to make his appeals. He's not sure what he's going to do. He consults with King Herod Agrippa for his counsel. Festus says, being perplexed, oporumenos is the Greek word. This is the word that in the King James Bible is translated as doubt or doubting. And let's look at that in the lexicon. And the dictionary form is aporeo. It's a verb, and it means to be perplexed, to be at a loss, or as the King James Bible puts it, to be in doubt. The origin of the word, it comes from a noun. Poros means a way or a passage. The prefix a, meaning not or to be without. So literally it means to be without a way. Aporeo, to be perplexed or at a loss. And there's another form of this word aporeo, and actually a more intensive form, which we find in Acts chapter 10. And it appears quite often in the New Testament. And this has to do with Peter's vision of the sheet that is lowered and containing unclean animals that he is commanded to kill and eat. And it says at the end of his vision, he was diapore, he was perplexed. And the dictionary form is diaporeo, a verb, meaning to be perplexed, to be in doubt, at a loss. Here's some really helpful information down here in the word study area. Diaporeo is from a prefix dia. Hey, we've seen this before, haven't we? Means through or thoroughly. It intensifies what? Aporeo. The word that we already looked at in Acts chapter 25. And this is a more intense form, to be totally perplexed. Or as some translations say, to be confused. So here we have 5 distinctly different Greek words that all can be translated into English as the word doubt, and carries a very different nuance in each context. Lately, when I have shared this study, my students have asked the obvious question. They said, when I'm reading the New Testament, come across the word doubt, how can I know what it means? What is the Greek word and what does it mean? Well, now you know how to find that information. It was that question that was the impetus for developing this video series and demonstrating how to use the Bible Hub interlinear tool. But there's one more thing we need to do with this study on the Greek words for doubt, and that is the concordance study, where these words are used and what they mean in their individual contexts. Well, I'd leave that to you to do on your own. I have posted links below. So proceed and enjoy your discoveries.